And so the Fed basically jumped in with emergency repo activity, not reverse repo, but repo. Because at that point, the reverse repo was drained. And there was this ongoing need to finance the deficits. And you also had a pretty strong dollar environment. So there was not a lot of foreign buying of Treasury. So kind of all the same setup happened, and it manifested in the reverse repo market getting messy. And the problem there is if that had persisted, it would have spilled over into the Treasury market because at that time, especially, the remaining buyer was hedge funds. And they were using repo to finance their Treasury purchases, and so obviously you can't finance at 7% and then buy whatever the T-bill was yielding back then, which was quite low. So they came in, they stopped doing reverse repo. There are some of us analyzing it at the time, like myself, Luke Roman, a handful of analysts, because a lot of people were trying to figure out what was happening. Whereas our argument was that this was basically a T-bill oversupply problem. But it's just historically that move has not happened without that over the coming quarters continuing into a recession. Now, I was hesitant to say at this time that some of those rules like that are potentially a little looser in this environment because we've never had a kind of this divergence between fiscal policy and monetary policy before. We've never kind of had such a big shock to the economy as COVID. And we never had this much so many people just left the labor force permanently after that. And so we have tighter labor force than normal. So, if there's any environment where some of these rules would be broken, like yield curve inversion, but it's, I'm not saying that they're going to be broken, but I'm kind of like, I'm observing things and saying this is normally not good, but it's, we'll see what happens. I think, I think that we've likely seen the top in interest rates. If you look at the amount of money that was created from bank loans, it was bigger than the fiscal deficits. Basically, the baby boomers were entering their home formation years. They were being born in the late 40s, and so by the time they entered the 70s, basically they're in household formation. And so you had a big uptick in bank lending, credit formation, and that was all else being equal inflationary, especially then when you add in constraints like oil crises and things like that. So combination of excess lending, credit formation with real world constraints. The 40s were different in the sense that it wasn't because of excessive bank lending. It was because of just very large fiscal deficits that at some points were monetized and some points were not. But basically, a lot of the new money creation was from these very large fiscal deficits. And so ever since we've kind of entered the 2020s, we've been in that similar type of environment where most of the money creation we've seen is not because banks are lending to an excessive degree. It's been very normal. Instead, it's mostly been very large monetized fiscal debt money markets. Which is a similar but slightly different metric. And you'll generally see that has not slowed down to the degree that M2 has. Because for all intents and purposes, people treat their money markets like cash, even though it can consist of T-bills and commercial papers and reverse repo and all these kind of wonky things. It's, for all intents and purposes, money. A T-bill is in many ways money, even though it's debt. Because even a dollar bill is a liability of the Fed. It's a type of debt in a sense. But basically, T-bills are money-like in a closer proximity than, say, stocks or long duration bonds are. And so things like money markets or the assets inside of money markets can be very money-like. And so in that sense, money supply is still growing pretty substantially. If you get a lot of T-bill issuance and a lot of money market usage, the overall kind of quote unquote real M2 is actually probably a little bit higher than what we see looking at the official M2 metric. And so while you can slow down it for a period of time, I do think it's likely to accelerate. And like you said, you generally want to keep up with broad money supply or different metrics of broad money supply, or at the very least keep up on a per capita basis. So if money supply is growing by 7% a year, population is growing by 1% a year, you should at least be trying to keep up by 6% per year.
Got it. Never thought about it like that. Yeah.
That way you're at least getting your share. Your share is not being diminished.
What a world. We have to keep track of how much new dollars come into existence just to not fall behind. So, and
I think that's the challenge. That's why inflationary policy works for policymakers, because the average person doesn't look at these things. And even if they could, it's hard to keep up with these things, right? It's hard. If money supply is going up by 7% a year and population is growing, you're saying, okay, I want to.
Someone on the side was artificially creating more credit receipts. They would dilute the favors that were going back and forth if they put those credit receipts into the system, right? Because it can kind of work, a credit-based system, as long as no one's like, you're in the village and no one's diluting it unintentionally. But if someone was diluting those favors back and forth, the whole kind of system breaks, which is at a bigger scale, I know what we kind of have today. So you just really helped form some of these thoughts that I had experienced as a younger person in Croatia with my aunt there through your book. So thank you for that, Lyn.
So I appreciate that example. It's great to hear that, because it's not, it's what happened in history, but it's also what happened in pretty local modern times, just outside.
Well, that was the 1980s. What I described as the 1980s.
Yeah, it's pretty recent. We have a similar phenomenon here with the Amish. It's not that far from where I am. The Amish, they live a more rural lifestyle, kind of purposely, without a lot of the king proclaiming that, like, all consumer debts past 7 years old are null and void now, right? That's a local, more manageable type of debt jubilee compared to these other ones we're having now. And going back to your prior point, the interesting thing about those kind of local credit-based monies is that they're actually, it's hard money in a way, because no one is diluting the favors, right? It's like everybody, because their memories are involved.
Some people might try to, but you're right. There's units of work that you're kind of remembered in your head on what's owed back to you. Yeah.
Yeah. Occasionally there's a default, but but aside, defaults happen in hard money environments. Basically, the money itself's not being aggressively diluted. And like you said, imagine if someone could kind of slip more favors in there.
Yeah.
And basically have more favors owed to them that for work they never did. Right. That'd be cheating. And yet that's exactly what we see in the current system. Are you using a commodity as a ledger? Basically, there's a certain rate that you can make new gold coins. It's hard to cheat the system. And if you have a share of gold in the community, you're kind of holding your spot on a ledger in a way of speaking. Or is it like a large centralized administrative ledger? Is it like the temples of Babylon or on their clay tablets? Or is it a central bank, right? So that's one thing I wanted to kind of explore, those two concepts, and show that they're really kind of two sides of the same coin in a way. The other one that I want to emphasize was the role of the telegraph in changing our money system more than we think, which is the fact that prior to that, transactions and settlements could move at roughly the same speed, right? So all information still moved at the speed of matter for the most part. Whereas with the telegraph, we could now send information around globally, roughly at the speed of light, in pretty high volumes, and yet any sort of physical settlement of something like gold was now kind of just, it's still material. It's still very slow, especially when you consider verification and the auditing of the gold itself. And so that kind of opened up the need for a lot of arbitrage